I've been the lighthouse keeper at Shale Creek for most of my life now. Not that it's a proper lighthouse, mind you. Just a weathered stone tower with a Fresnel lens at the top that guides boats through the treacherous narrows where Lake Michigan pushes into our little inlet. Most folks in town call it Miller's Folly, after the family that built it back in 1887, though the lighthouse itself is even older than that. The stonework dates back to the 1850s. Shale Creek, Michigan isn't on any tourist maps. We're tucked away in the Upper Peninsula, about 40 miles east of Marquette, population 438, according to the faded sign that hasn't been updated since the 1990 census. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the general store still keeps accounts in a leather-bound ledger, and where folks don't ask too many questions about the things they glimpse moving through the mist off the lake. Hello, viewers. If you wish your stories or experiences to be narrated by me, share them on our own subreddit, which you can join from the description below. I will pick the stories from the community and narrate them, and every once in a while, we will host a 3-hour story compilation. My name is Ellis Harmon, and I took over keeper duties when my uncle died back in '82. I was 22 then, fresh out of community college with a useless degree in history and no prospects. The lighthouse job came with a small salary from the local historical society, a cabin nestled against the pine forest, and utilities paid. Most importantly, it came with privacy. Dixon, my 3-legged mutt, has been with me for most of my tenure here. He showed up one winter morning 12 years ago, half-starved and missing his front right leg, leaving bloody paw prints in the snow. I never found out what happened to him, but the wound was clean, too clean for any natural predator. He's gray around the muzzle now, but his eyes are still sharp, especially when he looks out toward the water. Most people think I'm just a caretaker for a historical landmark, a local eccentric who spends his days polishing brass and giving the occasional tour to summer visitors. The townspeople smile and nod when they see me at Jorgensen's general store buying supplies, or sitting at the counter of the Pine Harbor Diner with a cup of black coffee and the weekly special. They think they know me. They don't know that in my cellar, there's a trap door set into the dirt floor secured with iron bands and 6 different locks. They've never seen the room beneath it, with walls lined in cedar and iron nails, where I keep the tools of my real trade. Salt harvested from 7 different oceans, silver blades that never tarnish, ancient texts bound in materials I try not to identify. They don't know what hunts in the darkness when the moon wanes. They don't understand why the town has never suffered a death by drowning, despite the treacherous waters. They've never questioned why certain fishing grounds remain untouched, no matter how plentiful the catch might be there. That's because of me, because of my family. For generations, we've stood between Shale Creek and the things that slither up from the cold depths of Lake Michigan. We are the line that must not break. The autumn of 1997 was when everything changed. When the rules I'd lived by for 15 years suddenly weren't enough. When what lurked in the lake grew bolder, and I learned that being a guardian means more than just following the old ways. The first Thursday in October brought an early frost to Shale Creek. I woke before dawn, as I always do, with Dixon's warm weight pressed against my legs and the familiar ache in my right shoulder, an old injury from a night I try not to remember. The bedroom window was rimmed with ice crystals, delicate patterns spreading across the glass like frozen ferns. I dressed quickly in the cold, flannel shirt, faded Levi's worn soft from years of wear, thick wool socks, and my father's old work boots, resoled so many times, there was hardly anything original left. Dixon watched from the bed, his one front paw tucked under his chest, reluctant to leave the warmth of the blankets. "Come on, old man," I said, my breath visible in the chill. Duty calls." Dixon sighed dramatically, but followed me downstairs, his nails clicking on the wooden steps. The main room was even colder, so I knelt by the fireplace and stirred the embers, adding kindling and a couple of split logs. Once the fire caught, I filled the percolator with water and set it on the stove, then pulled on my heavy canvas jacket. The morning air bit at my face as I stepped onto the porch, the kind of cold that sinks straight into your bones. The sky was still dark, stars sharp and clear in the blackness, the Milky Way a brilliant swath across the heavens. Far below, the town of Shale Creek was just a scatter of yellow lights, most people not yet awake. I made my way up the stone path to the lighthouse, breath trailing behind me in white clouds. The tower stood stark against the pre-dawn sky, a sentinel of weathered gray stone that had watched over this stretch of shoreline for nearly a century and a half. I unlocked the heavy oak door at its base with the iron key I always kept on a leather cord around my neck. As I worked in the lantern room, I watched the eastern horizon gradually lighten, the stars fading as the sky shifted from black to deep blue to the pale gray of approaching dawn. The lake stretched out before me, vast and dark, small white caps visible where the wind touched the surface. That's when I saw it. A disturbance in the water about half a mile offshore. Not the typical pattern of waves, but something else, as if the lake were being stirred from beneath. I grabbed the binoculars I kept on a shelf and focused on the spot. The surface was bulging upward, a dome of water rising several feet above the surrounding lake. As I watched, it collapsed back, leaving a perfect circle of calm in the otherwise choppy water. For a moment, I thought I could make out a shape beneath the surface, something massive moving slowly toward the shore. In 15 years as keeper, I'd seen many strange things, but this was new. I quickly finished my maintenance tasks and hurried back down the stairs, taking them two at a time despite my protesting joints. Back in the cabin, I found Dixon standing at the window, facing the lake, the fur along his spine raised. He didn't turn when I entered, just gave a low growl that I felt more than heard. "I see it too, buddy," I murmured, placing a hand on his rough coat. I went straight to the cellar door, lifting the trapdoor hidden beneath an old rag rug. The wooden steps creaked as I descended into the cool darkness, the smell of earth and old paper enveloping me. I lit the kerosene lamp hanging from a hook in the ceiling, illuminating the small space with flickering yellow light. The cellar walls were lined with shelves of canned goods, tools, and emergency supplies, things any sensible person living in the isolated Upper Peninsula would keep on hand. But at the far end, partially hidden behind a stack of firewood, was a heavy iron door set into the stone foundation. 7 keys hung on a nail beside it, each different, each necessary. I unlocked them in sequence, listening for the distinctive click of each tumbler falling into place. The door swung open with a groan of metal on metal, revealing a smaller room beyond. This was the true heart of my responsibility as keeper. The walls were covered in protective symbols, some carved directly into the stone, others painted in substances I tried not to think about too closely. Iron nails had been driven into the wood at precise intervals, creating patterns that seemed random but were anything but. A large oak table dominated the center of the room, its surface scarred and stained from years of use. Atop it sat a leather-bound book, its cover worn smooth by generations of hands. Beside it lay a collection of tools, silver knives with bone handles, vials of liquid that gleamed with unnatural colors, pouches of herbs and powders, and a revolver with intricate engravings along its barrel. I opened the book carefully, its pages brittle with age, and began to scan the careful handwriting of my ancestors. Each keeper had added to the knowledge contained within, documenting encounters, successful defenses, failures that cost lives. I was looking for anything that matched what I'd just witnessed on the lake. An hour later, I closed the book with a sigh. There were references to disturbances in the water, certainly. Lake Michigan had never been merely a lake to those who knew better, but nothing that precisely described the dome-like bulge I'd seen. I selected several items from the table: a pouch of black salt harvested from volcanic shores in Iceland, a small silver bell that rang with a tone that hurt human ears but repelled certain creatures, and a curved knife with symbols etched into the blade. These went into various pockets of my jacket. As I was closing up the hidden room, I heard Dixon barking upstairs, not his warning bark for approaching visitors, but the sharper, more urgent sound he made when he sensed something unnatural. I quickly locked the iron door, replaced the firewood, and hurried back up the cellar steps. Dixon was at the front window, paws up on the sill, barking frantically at something outside. I joined him, looking out toward the lake just as the sun breached the horizon. The beach, normally a gentle curve of pale sand and smooth stones, was littered with fish, hundreds of them, silver bodies glinting in the early morning light. They formed a perfect circle, each fish pointing inward like spokes on a wheel. At the center of the circle was a dark shape that, even from this distance, I could tell wasn't a fish or any natural debris. "Stay," I commanded Dixon, though I knew he'd follow anyway. I grabbed my walking stick, oak with a core of iron, another inheritance from Uncle James, and headed for the beach. The morning air had warmed slightly with the rising sun, but a chill wind still blew off the lake, carrying the smell of decay and something else, something ancient and wrong that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I approached the circle of fish, I slowed my pace, studying the pattern. The fish were freshwater species common to Lake Michigan: perch, walleye, a few small lake trout, but they hadn't washed up randomly. Each had been deliberately placed, their bodies bent to form the exact curve needed to complete the circle. At the center lay what I'd glimpsed from a distance, a chunk of dark, porous material about the size of a basketball. It resembled volcanic rock, but Lake Michigan had no volcanic activity in its geological history. I crouched down for a closer look, careful not to touch it. The surface seemed to shift slightly, as if the material wasn't entirely solid. Small iridescent bubbles formed and popped along its edges, releasing tiny puffs of greenish vapor that dissipated quickly in the morning air. I'd never seen anything like it in all my years as keeper, nor was there anything similar described in the family records. Whatever this was, it was new, or so old that knowledge of it had been lost. The payphone outside Jorgensen's general store was the only reliable one in Shale Creek. My cabin had a landline, but it worked about as often as it didn't, especially when storms rolled in off the lake. Since the sky was darkening with the promise of rain, I decided not to risk it. Using 2 sticks like oversized chopsticks, I had carefully lifted the strange object and placed it in a canvas bag. As soon as the object left the center of the circle, the fish began to twitch and flop, as if suddenly returned to life. Dixon barked and backed away as the nearest fish arched its body, its dead eyes somehow fixing on me. One by one, they slid back toward the water, leaving trails in the wet sand. Within minutes, the beach was empty except for Dixon and me. Now, the object sat in a locked metal box in the truck bed, lined with protective symbols hastily drawn in chalk as I parked in front of Jorgensen's general store. Downtown Shale Creek consisted of a single main street with buildings dating back to the timber boom days of the 1880s. Red brick facades with large windows and ornate cornices, most in need of repair, but still retaining their frontier dignity. Jorgensen's occupied the largest building, a two-story structure that housed the general store on the first floor and the family's apartments above. Dixon stayed in the truck, his one front paw on the dashboard as he watched me through the windshield. He hated being left behind, but I needed to make this call privately. The bell above the door jingled as I entered. The store was a marvel of efficient clutter. Shelves packed with everything from canned goods to fishing tackle, hardware to homemade preserves. The wooden floor creaked beneath my boots, worn smooth by decades of customers. "Morning, Ellis," called Martha Jorgensen from behind the counter. She was a plump woman in her 60s, with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her family had run the store for 4 generations, and she knew every resident of Shale Creek by name, history, and buying habits. "Morning, Martha," I replied, moving toward the back where the payphone hung on the wall. "Just need to make a quick call." The payphone was an ancient rotary model, its metal casing scratched and dented from years of use. I fed in quarters and dialed a number I knew by heart, though I rarely called it. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Bishop." "It's Ellis Harmon," I said quietly, turning my back to the store to prevent anyone from overhearing. "Something's come up at Shale Creek. I could use your expertise." Dr. Margaret Bishop had been my uncle's contact at the University of Michigan's Department of Great Lakes Studies, though her real expertise was in areas no academic institution would officially recognize. I described the disturbance I'd seen in the lake, the circle of fish, and the strange object I'd recovered. Bishop listened without interrupting, then asked several pointed questions about the exact location, the patterns in the sand, and the behavior of the fish afterward. "Ellis," she finally said, her voice noticeably tenser, "what you're describing matches something I've been tracking for the past month. Similar incidents have occurred at 3 other locations around Lake Michigan. In each case, local wildlife displayed unusual behavior, followed by the appearance of these stones, as the reports call them." "What are they?" I asked, lowering my voice further as a customer entered the store. "I don't know yet. The only sample I've been able to examine disintegrated before I could complete my analysis. But Ellis..." She paused. "In each location, 3 days after the appearance of the stones, people went missing. Always 3 individuals. Always without a trace." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October weather. "Today's the first day here," I said. "That gives us 2 more before..." "I'm catching the next flight to Marquette," Bishop interrupted. "Can you pick me up at the airport around 4 p.m.? "I'll be there," I promised. As I hung up the phone, Frank Matheson, Shale Creek's oldest commercial fisherman, entered the store. His weathered face broke into a smile when he saw me. "Ellis, just the man I was looking for," he said, making his way over. "Got something you might want to see." From his pocket, he pulled out a small object wrapped in a handkerchief and placed it in my palm. "Found this tangled in my net yesterday, out by the northeast shallows." I carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a small piece of the same dark, porous material as the one I'd found on the beach, but shaped unmistakably like a human finger. The sky had darkened considerably by mid-afternoon, heavy clouds rolling in from the west as I drove back to the lighthouse. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of rain and something else, something green and ancient that reminded me of the strange object secured in my truck. Dixon whined from the passenger seat, pressing his nose against the window. "It's all right, boy," I said as we climbed the winding road up the bluff. "We've got help coming." Rain began to fall, fat droplets that quickly turned into a steady downpour, drumming on the metal roof and reducing visibility to just a few yards ahead. As I rounded the final curve, the lighthouse came into view through the rain, its familiar silhouette somehow ominous in the gray afternoon light. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing at the base of the tower, tall and thin, unnaturally so, its shape seeming to waver like something viewed through water. I blinked, and it was gone. Just a trick of the light and rain, I told myself, though Dixon's low growl suggested otherwise. Inside the cabin, I placed the metal box containing the strange object on the kitchen table. Dixon circled it warily, never taking his eyes off it as I built up the fire and changed into dry clothes. The cabin felt different somehow, the familiar space altered by the presence of something that didn't belong. I knew I should examine the object more carefully, but exhaustion overtook me. I sank into my armchair by the fire, intending to rest my eyes for just a moment before heading to the airport to pick up Bishop. The dream came immediately, vivid and terrifying. I stood on the shore of Lake Michigan, but the water had receded hundreds of yards, revealing a landscape of mud and shipwrecks and things that should have remained hidden. A path had opened in the lake bed, leading down into darkness, and I was walking it, drawn forward by a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Come, Keeper," it whispered, the words bubbling up through the mud. "See what you've been guarding all these years. See what waits beneath." At the end of the path was a city, or what had once been a city, its architecture all wrong, buildings that tilted at impossible angles, streets that curved in ways that hurt my eyes to follow. And rising from the center, a tower of the same dark, porous material as the object I'd found on the beach. A figure with its back to me stood before the tower, human-shaped, but somehow wrong. It turned slowly, revealing a face that was not a face at all, but a swirling mass of darkness with points of light like distant stars. 3 days, it said, though it had no mouth to speak with. 3 sacrifices. Then the way opens and we return. The figure reached for me with 2 long fingers. I tried to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot, sinking into the mud. The hand drew closer, close enough that I could see the texture of its skin, not skin at all, but the same shifting, bubbling surface as the strange stone. Just as those fingers were about to touch my face, Dixon's sharp bark jolted me awake. He was standing at the window, hackles raised, growling at something outside. The dream clung to me like cobwebs as I shook myself fully awake. The rain had stopped, though water still dripped from the eaves. Through the window, I could see that afternoon had faded into evening, the sky a deep purple streaked with orange and red. I'd slept much longer than I'd intended. Bishop. I was supposed to pick her up at the airport. I glanced at the clock on the mantel and swore. 5:37 p.m. I was over an hour late. Just as I grabbed my keys, headlights swept across the cabin windows. A car was coming up the Lighthouse road. A rental, by the look of it. I tensed, one hand reaching for the shotgun propped beside the door. Dixon continued to growl, though he'd shifted his attention from the window to the front door. The car parked next to my truck, its engine cutting off. A moment later, there was a sharp knock at the door. 3 quick raps, then 2 slower ones, a pattern I recognized. Relief flooded through me as I moved to answer it. Bishop had found her own way here. I opened the door to find a woman in her early 60s standing on my porch, her silver hair cut short in a practical style, her face lined but her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You look like hell, Harmon," she said by way of greeting, "and you've got something in your house that doesn't belong in this world." "It's changed," Bishop said grimly, examining the object through the thick gloves she'd pulled from her bag. What had been a roughly spherical mass that morning was now distinctly taking on a shape, something vaguely humanoid, with limbs beginning to form from its central mass. The The surface still bubbled and shifted, but there was purpose to its movements now, as if it were being sculpted from within. Even more disturbing, the finger-like fragment Frank had given me was pulsing in rhythm with the larger mass, as if communicating across the distance between them. "What is it?" I asked, keeping my distance as Bishop conducted her examination. "A manifestation," she replied, her scientific detachment only partially masking her concern. "A physical anchor for something that exists primarily in another dimension." She looked up, meeting my eyes. "The natives called them the water people. They weren't entirely wrong." From her duffel bag, Bishop produced items I'd never seen before, strange metallic devices that hummed faintly when activated, vials of liquid that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and a small book bound in what looked like fish skin, its pages covered in writing that shifted when viewed directly. "These manifestations have been appearing all around Lake Michigan," she explained as she worked. "Always following the same pattern: unusual water disturbances, circles of dead animals, and then the appearance of these objects." She positioned one of the humming devices near the transforming mass. 3 days later, 3 people disappear. "Sacrifices," I murmured, remembering my dream. Bishop shot me a sharp look. "You've dreamed of them." It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. "That's how they find their targets," she said. "Through dreams, they identify the people they want to take, the weak, the susceptible, or sometimes, the ones who might stand in their way." Together, we constructed a containment vessel, a glass case reinforced with iron bands, its interior coated with a mixture Bishop prepared. When it was ready, we carefully transferred the evolving object and the smaller fragment into the container and sealed it. "That should hold it," she said finally, removing her gloves. "At least long enough for us to figure out what we're dealing with." "And what exactly are we dealing with?" I asked, watching as the object continued to reshape itself within its prison. Bishop's expression was grim. A forgotten civilization that predates human history. Beings that adapted to live beneath Lake Michigan when the waters rose thousands of years ago. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is from a journal written by a Jesuit missionary in 1721. He documented the beliefs of the Ojibwe people living around the lake." The paper revealed a handwritten account in faded ink, accompanied by crude drawings that bore a striking resemblance to the symbols I'd seen in the sand that morning. "The natives spoke of those who wait beneath the waters," Bishop continued. "Beings that came from the stars long before humans walked the earth. The Ojibwe left offerings to keep them from returning to the surface world." "Human offerings?" I asked. Bishop nodded solemnly. "The missionary recorded that every 7 generations, the beings would stir, sending emissaries to collect the sacrifices needed to maintain their slumber. 3 lives to purchase 70 years of peace." "That doesn't match what's happening now," I pointed out. "These appearances, it sounds like they're trying to come back, not stay asleep." "Exactly," Bishop said. "Something's changed. The pattern is broken." She glanced at the containment vessel, where the object was now unmistakably forming a small humanoid figure. "And I think I know what triggered it." She pulled out a newspaper clipping. 3 months ago, a research vessel named the Horizon was mapping the deepest parts of Lake Michigan using new sonar technology. They found something, a structure they called it, sitting at the bottom of the lake in an area that shouldn't have any man-made objects. The article included a grainy sonar image, a massive curved shape rising from the lake bed with smaller structures clustered around it. "The expedition never returned," Bishop concluded. "The official story is that they hit rough weather and sank. But I think they woke something that's been sleeping for a very long time. and now it's calling its children home. Dixon let out a low whine from his spot by the door, his ears pressed flat against his head. Outside, the night had fully settled over Shale Creek, and with it came a heavy mist rolling in from the lake, thick and unnatural for the season. Through the window, I could see the beam from the lighthouse cutting through the darkness, its familiar rhythm somehow ominous now. "We have 2 days before they take someone," I said, mentally cataloging the weapons and tools in my hidden room. "How do we stop it?" The next morning dawned with an unnatural stillness. No birds sang in the pines surrounding the lighthouse. No waves crashed against the shore below. The mist that had rolled in during the night still clung to the landscape, dense and immobile despite the light breeze that should have dispersed it. "It's like the whole world is holding its breath," Bishop remarked as we stood on the porch, surveying what little we could see through the fog. She had spent the night in my spare bedroom, though I doubted she'd slept much. The light under her door had remained on until well past midnight, and I'd heard her pacing, muttering to herself as she worked through our problem. Dixon refused to leave the cabin, something he'd never done before. He lay by the door, watching us anxiously through the screen, whining softly whenever we moved too far from the house. "Smart dog," Bishop said. "He knows what's out there better than we do." We had spent most of the night devising a plan. According to Bishop's research and my family records, the emerging pattern pointed to 3 specific locations around Shale Creek, where the anchors, the strange objects like the one we'd contained, would appear before the disappearances began. "The first was your beach," Bishop said, consulting the map spread out on the porch railing. "Based on the patterns from the other incidents around the lake, the second should appear somewhere near the center of town, and the third at the farthest point where fresh water meets the land, likely the creek that gives the town its name." "Shale Creek itself," I nodded, "where it bubbles up from the underground spring in MacArthur's woods." Our plan was simple, if desperate. We would locate and contain the remaining 2 anchors before they could fully manifest, then use the contained objects in a ritual that Bishop believed would sever the connection between our world and whatever was stirring beneath the lake. "It won't stop them forever," she'd warned me, "but it might buy us time. Enough to find a more permanent solution." I checked my watch. 8:17 a.m. "We should head into town," I said. "If the pattern holds, the second anchor should be appearing soon." Bishop nodded, gathering the specialized equipment she'd brought, detection devices that looked like antique radio components, but functioned on principles I couldn't begin to understand. I carried a canvas bag with the tools we'd need for containment: iron filings, salt, silver chains, and vials of holy water Bishop had brought from a cathedral in Chicago. The drive into town was tense, the fog parting reluctantly before our headlights, only to close again behind us like a living thing. The few people out and about moved slowly, as if underwater, their eyes vacant and unfocused. None acknowledged our presence, even those who knew me well. "They feel it," Bishop murmured as we passed Martha Jorgensen sweeping the sidewalk in front of her store with mechanical, repetitive movements. "They don't know what it is, but their bodies do. Instinct older than civilization." We parked in the small town square, a modest green space with a gazebo and a weather-beaten statue of the town's founder. Bishop immediately pulled out one of her devices, a brass contraption with multiple dials and a needle that swung erratically as she turned slowly in place. "This way," she said, pointing toward the small brick building that housed the town's library and historical society. "The energy signature is strongest there." The library was empty, save for the elderly librarian, Mrs. Caldwell, who sat at her desk staring blankly at a book she wasn't reading. She didn't look up as we entered, didn't blink when Bishop waved a hand in front of her face. She's in a trance, Bishop explained in a hushed voice. A defensive mechanism. Her mind has retreated from what it can't comprehend. The device led us to the local history section in the back, where glass cases displayed artifacts from Shale Creek's past. Arrowheads, logging tools, faded photographs of stern-faced settlers. One case contained items recovered from shipwrecks, a ship's bell, a compass, the captain's log from a vessel lost in 1891. Bishop's detector went wild as we approached this display, the needle spinning frantically, the brass components vibrating in her hand. "There," she said, pointing to a dark object sitting among the shipwreck artifacts, an item that didn't belong, that I was certain hadn't been there the last time I'd visited. Unlike the amorphous mass we'd found on the beach, this anchor had already taken form, a small but perfectly detailed sculpture of a lighthouse. Not any lighthouse, but Miller's Folly, down to the cracks in the stone and the distinctive pattern of the lantern room. The material was the same shifting, bubbling substance, its surface crawling with tiny iridescent patterns. "It's further along in its development," Bishop said, her voice tight. "We need to contain it now, before—" The case glass shattered outward, showering us with fragments as the lighthouse sculpture rose into the air, hovering at eye level. A low, pulsing hum emanated from it, and the air around it rippled like heat waves off hot asphalt. "Run!" Bishop shouted, shoving me toward the door as the floating object began to spin, faster and faster, the humming intensifying to a painful pitch that made my ears feel like they were bleeding. We crashed through the library doors just as every window in the building exploded outward. Behind us, Mrs. Caldwell finally screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror that followed us into the mist-shrouded street. We didn't stop running until we reached the truck, our lungs burning, ears ringing from the unnatural sound. As I fumbled with the keys, Bishop kept watch, her face pale but determined. "It's following us," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Not physically yet, but it's connected to us now. It knows we're trying to stop it." The engine roared to life, and I pulled away from the curb with more speed than was safe in the thick fog, but fear drove me harder than caution. The town seemed abandoned now, doors and windows closed tight, not a soul visible on the streets. "What happens now?" I asked as we raced back toward the lighthouse, the mist closing behind us like a door. "It'll complete its manifestation faster than we anticipated," Bishop replied, checking the strange devices in her bag. "The 3 anchors will connect, creating a gateway for whatever's waiting beneath the lake. We need to get back to the first anchor. It's our only chance to disrupt the pattern." At the lighthouse, Dixon greeted us with frantic barking, circling our legs as if trying to herd us away from danger. The mist was thinner here on the bluff, but the air felt wrong, heavy with moisture that tasted of salt and metal, though Lake Michigan is freshwater. The containment vessel we'd constructed still held the first anchor, but the object inside had changed dramatically. What had been a vague humanoid shape was now a perfect miniature replica of a person, specifically me. Every detail was captured in the shifting, porous material, down to the scar above my left eyebrow and the slight stoop of my right shoulder from my old injury. "That's not good," Bishop said, her scientific detachment slipping. "It's chosen its first sacrifice." My mind raced back to my dream, the city beneath the water, the figure with the star-filled face. 3 sacrifices, it had said. Then the way opens. "We can't wait for the 3rd anchor to appear," I said. "We need to perform the ritual now, with what we have." Bishop hesitated, then nodded. "It's risky, but you're right. We're out of options." We worked quickly, Bishop directing me as we prepared the ritual components. Silver chains laid in a circle around the containment vessel. Candles at precise intervals, their flames burning blue in the charged air. Ancient words spoken in a language that felt wrong in my mouth, syllables that seemed to bend and twist as they left my lips. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like something alive, seeking entry. The lighthouse beam cut through it rhythmically, creating momentary clearings that revealed glimpses of movement, tall, thin shapes that should not be walking on land. As we neared the ritual's climax, the miniature replica of me inside the containment vessel began to melt, its features running like wax, the material bubbling more violently. The same happened to the lighthouse sculpture we'd retrieved from the library, its structure collapsing into formless mass. "It's working," Bishop whispered, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining the ritual's complex patterns. Then the window shattered, a tendril of fog whipping into the room like a physical force. It struck Bishop across the face, sending her sprawling. The ritual circle broke, silver chains scattering across the floor. The containment vessel cracked, then exploded outward, showering the room with glass and the dark, porous material that had formed the anchors. It moved with purpose now, flowing across the floor like a living thing, gathering itself into a column that gradually took shape. A figure too tall, too thin, with proportions that hurt the eye. "Ellis Harmon," it said in a voice like water rushing over stones. "Keeper of the shore, guardian of the boundary. We have waited so long to meet you." They found my truck 3 days later, parked at the Shale Creek Scenic Overlook just off Route 41. The keys were still in the ignition, my wallet on the seat. The search parties combed the woods for a week before giving up. The official report lists me as missing, presumed drowned, just another tragic statistic in the long history of Lake Michigan's appetite for human life. Dixon found a home with Martha Jorgensen. She tells visitors he still goes to the lighthouse every day, sits on the beach, and watches the water until sunset. Some nights, she says, he howls at the moon like he's calling to someone far away. Dr. Margaret Bishop returned to the University of Michigan. Her paper on mass hysteria and temporary fugue states in isolated rural communities won an award, though it bears little resemblance to what really happened in Shale Creek that October. There are some truths academia isn't ready to accept. The town recovered, as small towns do. The strange fog lifted after 3 days. The vacant expressions disappeared from people's faces. Life returned to normal, or what passed for normal in a place haunted by ancient things. The fishing improved. Frank Matheson claims it's the best season he's seen in 40 years. No one mentions the strange lights, sometimes visible beneath the surface of the lake on moonless nights. The lighthouse stands empty now. The Historical Society tried to find a new keeper, but somehow the position remains vacant. Volunteers maintain the light, keeping it burning through storm and calm, but none will stay after dark. They say the place feels wrong somehow, unwelcoming. They're right to feel that way, because I'm still here, in a sense. Not in any form you'd recognize, but here, nonetheless. The bargain I struck that night wasn't what the water people expected. Not a surrender, but an exchange. One life freely given to protect hundreds. One guardian transformed rather than sacrificed. I walk the shoreline now in the hours between midnight and dawn. My footprints crystallize the sand where I pass, then dissolve with the coming light. I watch over Shale Creek from beneath the waters, my domain expanded rather than ended. The water people honor our agreement. They take no one from the town, disturb no ships passing on the lake. In return, I serve as intermediary between their world and mine, between the depths and the land, between what humanity knows and what it must never discover. Perhaps in time another keeper will come. Someone with the right instincts, the right bloodline. someone who senses the truth beneath the surface of things. When they do, they'll find the lighthouse ready, the hidden room beneath the cellar stocked with what they'll need. And they'll find my journal, this account, waiting to guide them. Because the line must not break, the light must not fail. Some boundaries should never be crossed, and some guardians never truly die.